Don't you just love this gospel reading? If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. If your eye causes you to stumble, tear it out. Better to enter the kingdom of God with one eye than have two eyes and be thrown into hell where their worm never dies and the fire is never quenched. Everyone will be salted with fire. I get so excited when I see this text coming up in the lectionary that I can hardly contain myself. In fact, I love preaching on this text so much that when I look back into my files to see what I had done with it before, I discovered that I have avoided preaching on it my whole ministry. I preached on the James text a number of times. I preached on the Numbers text, never this one. And I can tell you that we love it and take it so seriously too. I mean, this morning, I decided to really be observant as you all came in to worship to see how many of you have one hand or one foot or one eye. I mean, most Sundays, we begin worship with confession, right? We confess that we're captive to sin and cannot free ourselves. Or today we said, we have not allowed your grace to set us free. Now, something like that. I mean, with all the times we confess, you'd think that we would be a church with no hands or no feet or no eyes. I mean, if you take this gospel reading seriously. But as I watched people come in, I didn't notice anybody minus a hand or a foot or an eye. So what's going on here? What's Jesus getting at? Well, first of all, obviously, I think we all get that Jesus can't be serious about cutting off a hand or a foot or tearing out an eye. I mean, we don't take it literally. I mean, this is hyperbole. This is shock language. It's gross exaggeration to get us thinking and to make a point. Jesus is being pretty tough on his hearers, and he's making them squirm a little bit, and he's making them uncomfortable, which means that a sermon on this text has to do the same thing, right? In other words, this is one of those prophetic sermons that makes people uncomfortable and squirm, makes people question, and maybe might even make people get angry. Well, the key to understanding this text here is its context. And unfortunately, those who decided to put together the Revised Common Lectionary that we use removed the context when they gave us just these verses. This reading today follows immediately after last Sunday's gospel reading, and it's actually all part of the same story. Mark likes to use this technique where he starts a story, and then he inserts another story into the middle of it, and then he goes back and finishes the first story. Problem is, with today's reading, we don't have the first part of the story. All we get is the second part, and then the ending to the first part. It's out of context. So, do you remember last Sunday's gospel reading? Jesus and his disciples have traveled to Capernaum. And on the way there, they're discussing about who is the greatest. Well, Jesus must have heard, because he asked them once they get there, well, what were you talking about while you were on the way? And they didn't want to tell him because I think they knew that they shouldn't be arguing about who was the greatest. So Jesus sits down and has his disciples all gather around him. And then he tells them that if you want to be first and if you want to be the greatest, you have to be the last of all and servant of all. And then he invites a little child to come on up. And he puts his arm around the little child and he says, whoever welcomes one child like this in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me. In other words, God. So welcoming a child is welcoming God. And then, right after that, as he still has his arm around this child, John says to Jesus, "Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he was not following us." But Jesus said, Do not stop him, for no one who does a deed of power in my name will soon afterward be able to speak evil of me. Whoever is not for us is against us. For truly I tell you, whoever gives you a cup of water to drink because you bear the name of Christ will by no means lose his reward. If any of you put a stumbling block before one of these little ones who believes in me, it would be better if a great millstone were cast around your neck and you were thrown into the sea. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life maimed than to have two hands and go to hell, to the unquenchable fire. And if your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life lame than to have 2 feet and be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to stumble, tear it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with one eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into hell, where their worm never dies and the fire is never quenched. You see, Jesus is saying all the stuff about stumbling blocks and cutting off hands and feet and tearing out eyes while he has a little child in his arms. He's saying that little children are so important and so wonderful that we have to eliminate anything and everything that might keep them from Jesus. See, this reading today is all about stumbling blocks and eliminating the stumbling blocks that we put in front of children and that keep them from Jesus. And you don't see that until you realize that Jesus says all these words with a child in his arms. Amy Oden, who is a professor of early church history and spirituality at St. Paul's School of Theology, writes this: through images of body parts, Jesus makes clear that stumbling blocks are not other people or things outside of us. They are part of us. These stumbling blocks might be events, practices, the way we've always done it, or our own pet causes. Stumbling blocks that come disguised as precious body parts are so dangerous they should be severed. The violence of Jesus' hyperbole here is inescapable. He uses an over-the-top, bolded in all caps format to get the disciples and our attention. We are likely to think there's nothing worse than losing a hand, a foot, or an eye. But Jesus says there is. The consequence of causing another to stumble are far worse than self-maiming. When the very things we hold dear and believe lead to abundant life become instead obstacles to the little ones, it leads to the death of unquenchable fire. Self-maiming is preferable to the violence against others we commit with these parts of ourselves. This week's gospel lesson invites us as congregations to examine the stumbling blocks we place, often unknowingly, often in faithful enthusiasm, in front of the most vulnerable among us. Let me read your last sentence again. This week's gospel lesson invites us as congregations to examine the stumbling blocks we place, often unknowingly, often in faithful enthusiasm, in front of the most vulnerable among us. This text this week and these words have poked and prodded and challenged and made me uncomfortable all week as I thought about how we might be creating stumbling blocks for little children. One thing that has really nagged at me ever since I started as pastor here last fall is the question, why are there so few children here? Now, I know that Sunday school attendance across the ELCA and other denominations has dropped dramatically in the past number of years. I know that the majority of churches have less children. And I know that there are all kinds of sports activities on Sunday morning that draw children and young families away from worship. But I also know that People's Church, which is just up the street from us in the same context, has lots of kids. And I also know that River Terrace Church, just on the other side of campus on Hagedorn, the same context, has lots of kids. So I wonder, why don't we? I talked a couple weeks ago about making the table bigger. Do you remember Table Maximus? And I talked about welcoming all people like our marvelous welcome statement says. But welcoming all people includes welcoming children and doing everything that we can to welcome children and removing any stumbling blocks that might be keeping children away. And so I keep asking myself, what are the stumbling blocks that we've created here? Because obviously we've created some. We're just not aware of them. What are the appendages that we need to cut off and tear out? What are the events and the practices and the way we've always done it and the pet causes that might be stumbling blocks to children and young families? Now, I don't have answers to all those questions. I do have some ideas and suspicions as to what might be the stumbling blocks. But I think Jesus is challenging us here and warning us and even goading us to take a serious look at the stumbling blocks that we've created and that get in the way of welcoming children. And removing the stumbling blocks? Well, it might be as easy as pulling out a couple of pews in the front here and putting some tables and chairs up here so children can worship and participate in an age-appropriate way, even if it means a little bit of noise and distraction. Or it might be as difficult as changing the way we've always done it. Or as difficult as letting some ministry die so it can give birth to something new. Or changing some worship practice that might be as precious to us as a hand or a foot or an eye. But whatever that stumbling block is, Jesus says, cut it off, tear it out, because the stakes are incredibly high. Last week, Pastor Haley Vey started her sermon by inviting you to think about a child that has been significant in your own life and imagine that child as the one in the gospel reading that Jesus takes and puts his arm around. It was a great way of entering into the gospel story. Well, I want to take that a step further this week and end the sermon by inviting you again to imagine a child that you love, a child that you would like to see grow in faith and love of Jesus. Maybe it's your own child, or maybe it's a grandchild or a great-grandchild, or maybe a niece or nephew or a neighborhood child. But as you imagine this child that you love, I want to invite you to ask yourself if there is any event or any practice or the way we've always done it or any pet cause that is so precious and so sacred that you wouldn't be willing to cut it off or tear it out so that this child would know the love of Jesus. Is there anything?